So he was celebrated by Stalin, but he was also celebrated on the front page of Time. They said, "This is the man, this is what people should be like." And I want to pose a question to you, which I will not answer until towards the end of the talk. According to the Office of National Statistics, which is our main body of official statistics, there's one form of activity which has more economic value than any other in this country. And yet, it is given a value of 0 in measures of GDP and economic growth. I pose the question, what is that form of work? And I'll leave it. There's another debate which has been taking place saying that with AI and technological changes, etc., we're going to see the end of work. I'm sure you're all familiar with this claim as a sort of technological determinism. One of the themes in the book is, on the contrary, we could be at the cusp of a new revolution in the way we live, in which we will see a revival of work. But everything depends on definitions. And every age throughout history has had some stupidity about what is work and what is not work. And I believe our age is the most stupid of all. Now, the book goes back to ancient Greece. And the ancient Athenians had a conceptualization of time which is much more sophisticated than we have today. Essentially, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and the others divided time into 6 types of activity. The first was labor. Labor was done by the banosoi, the metics, the slaves. It was done for exchange value. And it was what a citizen did everything possible to avoid. And Socrates made the point that if you're going to do labor, it's much better to do insecure labor, because then you aren't induced to have doulia, a sense of servility and dependence on labor. And they differentiated between labor and work. Work was what the citizen did. It's a slave-based society, it was a sexist society, so I don't want to over-romanticize it. I'm talking about the concepts. Essentially, work was what you did with your friends, with your relatives, around the house. It was involved in philia, civil friendship. And in addition, they had recreation. Recreation was to keep you fit, led to the Olympics. But it was differentiated from leisure, a distinction we've lost. Because leisure was schole, or schole, which was a combination of education and public participation in the life of the polis. A citizen tried to maximize his time in work and schole, but a third form also, urgia. Urgia was regarded as essential for any civilized human being. And urgia literally translates as idleness. It was essential to have a sense of being able to be idle. And this was taken forward by Cato in a famous aphorism: never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing. And we have lost that sense of respect for idleness. Now it's a derogatory term used by politicians and say, oh, these idle buggers, you know, all that stuff. And a final activity that the Greeks recognized, and this is very important to my narrative in the book, a sense of what's called eranos. Now, eranos was essentially the base of commoning, shared activities in society. And commoning and commons are the central theme of our early history. Because after the Justinian Codex, I don't want to go into details, of AD 529, there was a recognition that the commons was a legitimate form of property, and to common, a verb, to common, was regarded as a very essential part of a good society. Now, this went forward into the two constitutional documents of our state. The Charter of the Forest and the Magna Carta of November 1217. These define our constitution. And what they did was they recognized the right to work in the commons, the right to common. And all the class struggles that you would trace through our history have been about the lower commoners wanting to rescue the right to work, whereas the state and capital has wanted to enforce the duty to labour. This was the essence of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, Kett's Rebellion in 1547, the Levellers and the Diggers and the Civil War of the 17th century, the Blacking movement in the 1720s, the Luddites who have been misrepresented ever since in the early 19th century, all the way through to William Morris's Socialist League in the 1890s. And what basically was happening was that there was a crisis in the first of the three time regimes that I describe in the book. The first time regime I call the agrarian regime, which was time determined by the seasons, the climate, the area you lived in. And if you went across villages across this country, there would have been different time zones everywhere you went. Very strange thing to think today. So you could go from one village and it's 12 o'clock, and you could go to the next village and it's only 3 o'clock. You know, this was common right the way through our early history. And the class struggle that took place was between the commoners wanting to retain the value of commoning and work, whereas the landlords and the emerging capitalists wanting people more and more to be doing labour. To cut a long story short, essentially this broke down in the 16th century. And the Tudors were the instruments of establishing the base of capitalism and the proletarianization of the majority of people. And they did this through the enclosures, huge enclosures of Henry VIII in particular, and the introduction of wonderful devices like the Vagabondage Acts of the 1540s. And under the Vagabond Acts, a person caught not labouring, who was poor, the first time they did such a terrible thing, they were branded with a V. The second time, if they were caught not labouring, they were hanged. And what is not remembered in our history books is that over 100,000 men were hanged because of the heinous crime of not doing jobs. Don't tell Ian Duncan Smith about this, you might get ideas. Now, this period ushered in the industrial time regime. And the industrial time regime is very different. It divides life into blocks. You get up in the morning, you go to labour in a factory, you go home if you've still got some energy to have some sex, you do a bit of sex, you drop to bed. You get up, you go to school for a few years, long years of labour, short period of retirement if you're lucky, drop dead. Okay? Blocks. And this took time to emerge because during the 18th and 19th century, there was tremendous resistance by people who didn't want to be proletarianized. But gradually that took place, and interestingly, in the middle of the 19th century, when Karl Marx said the right to work in capitalism is a pious, miserable thing. It's impossible. Okay? And in a sense, he was right. But the 1850s also saw a period in which stable labour was sought by capital. The very things that trade unions have been fighting for, stable labour, the the capitalists of the time would have said, great, bring it on. That's what we want. People to be in stable labour. But during the 19th century, as I trace in the book, in the chapter on industrial time, there came a moment at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century when they made what I feel was the great era of modernity. And that was when suddenly being in labour was regarded as a nirvana. Everybody should be in labour. So you had communists wanting everybody to be in labour. If you didn't labour, you weren't allowed to eat. Remember the Soviet constitution? You had the Fabians forming the Labour Party and openly saying if any youth is not doing labour, they must be sent to forced labour camps. Beatrice Webb and so on. You had a sort of wholesale commitment to getting everybody into jobs. And Taylorism came up. Frederick Taylor, no doubt many of you are familiar with his work. He wrote a book on scientific management, and he helped Ford set up the Ford factory and so on. And Taylorism said that he wanted to make sure that jobs were designed so that the workers in them had to do as little thinking as possible. All of us remember Modern Times of Charlie Chaplin, but essentially Taylorism is designed management systems. And at the end of the 20th century, in 2001, the International Institute of Management said it's the most important document of the 20th century. So it's still guiding the way we look at work and labour. Now, the peak was a certain gentleman called Stakhanov. In 1935, this gentleman in the Soviet system managed to mine physically with his own hands 14 times his quota of coal in one day. So he was celebrated by Stalin. Stalin put his name to a monograph celebrating Stakhanov, but he was also celebrated on the front page of Time in the United States. They said, this is the man, this is what people should be like. And Stakhanov has influenced the development of performance appraisals, human resource development departments, all sorts of other things that have continued to characterize our time regime today. The ILO, where I worked for some years at a fairly senior level, was set up to make for decent labour, to take labour out of international trade, but to make sure that labour was on a pedestal and that everybody should be doing decent labour. Notice that all forms of work that were not labour disappear from our statistics, disappear from our rhetoric, disappear from our public imagination. You're getting the picture, of course. And what happened then, of course, is after the Second World War, we had the embedded phase of labourism. Well, we had Beveridge, who's put on a pedestal by too many people. He was an eugenicist, and he wanted a social security system that rewarded people who did labour or who depended on labour, i.e. housewives and mothers, who were secondary. And the system that developed was, again, putting on a pedestal labour, jobs, and GDP growth. Now, I should remind you that the concept of GDP was developed in the late 1930s by Simon Kuznets in the United States as a measure of mobilizable resources for the war. So it reasoned in the measurement of GDP, which is what Starmer and Sunak and Liz Truss, bless her little soul, if she's got one, are espousing, which is GDP excludes the answer to my question. The most valuable form of work in this country is unpaid care. And the ONS has estimated that it's worth nearly 900 billion pounds a year in this country. It is clearly a valuable form of work that is totally ignored.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.